Off the record.
I think that's good.
Welcome to Off the Record, bite-sized summaries of interesting topics in law for businesses in Queenstown that don't have time to read. My name is Scott Donaldson. I'm a senior associate at the law firm Mac Todd. Mac Todd's a firm based in Queenstown and Cromwell. Today's topic is a really interesting one, potentially transformative for New Zealand economy, the way that the employee-employer relationship works in New Zealand, and that topic is fair pay agreements. Massive issue potentially coming up in New Zealand. Here to talk to us about fair pay agreements is my co-host Alice Milne. Welcome, Alice. Alice is in the commercial team at Mac Todd, practicing in the area of employment law. Welcome, Alice.
Thank you, Scott. It's great to be here. Such an interesting topic.
It really is.
Yeah. It's definitely fallen under the radar a little bit, but won't be for long.
As you said, this certainly hasn't been getting the sort of coverage that you might expect, given its far-reaching implications. So, what are fair pay agreements?
Fair pay agreements are essentially the fair pay agreements scheme is a way for employees in a particular industry or occupation to band together and bind employers to minimum floor terms. So whether that's pay, hours of work, overtime rates, and it potentially applies across that whole occupation or industry. So it's really quite far-reaching. We used to employment individual agreements, but this is sector industry-wide agreements.
Okay. So there's a bill going through Parliament at the moment. It's passed its first reading and potentially could be law by the end of this year. So how does it actually work in practice? We know what the concept of a fair pay agreement is, being a collective sort of bargain between employees and employer in an industry or in an occupation. But what's the process? Like how does this all happen?
Well, it's legislated scheme, so 10% of a workforce, so whether that's all supermarket workers in New Zealand or all lawyers in New Zealand, or 1,000, so 10% or 1,000 is the trigger. And once you get that, you get a representative party for the employees, so that's probably a union, and they apply to the government to initiate bargaining. And so once that takes place, all the employers that are covered, they're going to get notified and they have to get around a negotiating table and negotiate some terms and conditions that apply across that entire industry. Much like the current collective agreement scheme, except that it applies across the industry and that you have to agree.
Okay.
So you can't back out. Employers can't back out of this scheme, and if you can't reach an agreement, you have to go to the Employment Relations Authority.
Right. Okay. So 10% of participants or employees in a particular industry or a particular occupation, or 1,000, can potentially go along to the government and say, we would like a fair pay agreement for our industry or occupation. And what happens then? So they get together and start negotiating around the table?
Yeah. So they've got to agree on a few things. They've got to agree on pay, hours of work, overtime, and penalties. So, it does mirror the collective bargaining scheme we've got in New Zealand, except that they have to agree on terms. So if they cannot agree on the terms, then essentially you've got a draft document and it goes to the Employment Relations Authority to fix the terms. And essentially, if that gets ratified, so if the majority of employees and employers vote and pass the agreement, it becomes a collective agreement that applies across the board. So, yeah, it's pretty far-reaching.
Okay. As I understand, there might be an even lower sort of threshold in some circumstances to the 10%. Is that right? Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, the alternative is a public interest test. So, all of the employees who are applying to the government, to Ministry of Business to initiate bargaining, the alternative is that they are what's the word? Potentially, it's in the public interest that gets that process gets initiated. So whether they've been historically underpaid or low paid workers, or something of the kind. Yeah.
Sounds very subjective, doesn't it?
It's just a draft bill.
It is a draft bill, yeah. So if I'm a business in Queenstown, maybe I'm a tourism operator, maybe I own a shop, maybe I'm, run a building company, something like that. Is this going to affect me? How would I be affected?
Absolutely. We're talking. This scheme is targeting low-income wage earners. So, you've got hospitality staff, you've got cleaners, you've got all tourism operators in Queenstown are going to absolutely be affected by the changes. It's a scheme, and so the implementation rates and uptake. I guess it's going to depend on the government's capacity to. Ministry of Business's capacity to actually facilitate those negotiations and ratification process. But yeah, absolutely, it's gonna affect a lot of industries.
Okay, so let's say a hospitality industry, potentially a union could get 1,000 workers from the hospitality industry, pretty low bar really, and go along to the government and say, we would like a fair pay agreement for all hospitality workers in New Zealand. Wow.
But I mean, so they get to that point. So they get to the point where the employees have gone along to the government. They've applied to do this process. They've elected a representative, and they've negotiated over the table about minimum terms. And they get to a point where there's a draft agreement. They still have to have a majority vote. So 50% plus one, yeah. So, it's a major shift. It's a major shift. And so, if we're talking I'll keep it relevant, lawyers in New Zealand, they would, we would be affected employees. We would have to vote 50% plus one to have this come into effect. But if we don't agree, it goes to the Employment Relations Authority to fix terms that apply across the sector. Yeah.
So there are a few people out there in New Zealand, a small handful, who sadly sometimes in the evenings watch Parliament TV at night, and occasionally I admit to be one of them. And one of the things that I heard Michael Wood, and who's the minister in charge of, I forget his title, but he's the
Workplace Relations.
Workplace Relations, that's it, has said that there are collective bargainings, a similar scheme to this in places like Germany, places like Australia, those being rich countries. Employees are well paid, high standard of living, and he would say, well, if we do this here, we can also expect the same result. But we know employee participation with unions is really low in New Zealand. Yeah. So as we understand it now, the bill has gone through the first reading, which is a purely perfunctory sort of step, really. It's not necessarily the bill that's been introduced to Parliament isn't what ultimately going to be there. So when is it going to become law? Can people get involved? Can they make submissions?
Yeah, well, it's not law yet. It flew through its first reading last week. The government votes, and it's now basically they're taking submissions. And get behind it. I think it's important to
get behind it.
Yeah, it's important.
You can get behind it.
Get behind the submission process.
Get behind it.
The submission process is an important part of any bill, and National's already said they're going to wipe it out next year if they get elected. As has ACT, I think. So it's important for businesses at the very least to get their heads around what it is, what the scheme is, and what it potentially means, because it's already on its way.
So worthwhile making a submission. The submissions process is open until 19th of May?
19th of May or the 29th. Late May.
Late May,
Late
okay.
May.
All right. come to us and ask us if you're not sure. We'll tell you. Send us an email and we'll tell you. So submissions are opening for another couple of another 6 weeks or so, let's say. And really important that people make submissions, isn't it? Because there are business people, maybe even there's a few employees that are watching out there that maybe think this is a great idea, or maybe they think it's a terrible idea, who have an opinion, who have a position. Particularly in Queenstown, we know that the business environment in Queenstown is different than other places for a whole bunch of reasons. A good portion of the economy is based around tourism, which has been dragged over the coals in the last couple of years, and a lot of businesses in that industry will be thinking, well, this is the last thing that I need. But also things about what happens in their particular workplace. Those questions about flexibility, I mean, those are really important, because there'll be businesses who will say, well, we don't think that this can actually work in our workplace simply because we don't have as well-defined sort of jobs. The person that does the cleaning also does the marketing. That's an extreme example, but just in terms of that flexibility, it's really important that people have their say.
It's about being involved and being part of the discussions, because like Scott said, there are a lot of potential ambiguity, like areas that need to be ironed out, and that could be subject to change. They've already talked about there being regional differences between, say, wage rates in Auckland versus cost of living in Invercargill is much lower, or the other thing that they've talked about, I think, is a bit of a hardship scheme. So, businesses in Queenstown in particular might be considered for that. And as part of those discussions, you have to get behind it and be part of what is potentially going to be a massive shift in the way we conduct relations.
Because there's no reason to really think that this won't happen. I mean, we have a government we have a majority, we have a one-party government. They have the votes, and this is what they're wanting. I mean, they haven't brought it out to have a look at this and we'll decide later. They've made a decision that they think that the way that employment agreements should be negotiated for some people is by collective bargaining. And so we can really expect this to happen. Of course, there is an election next year, and who knows what sort of longevity the law might have. Should there be a change of government, but certainly there is every there's every reason to believe that this is what will happen. So it's really important that businesses have a good understanding of what the law is, and start to consider how they might be affected as a business. And certainly we are very happy to assist with giving advice to businesses about how they might be impacted, clarifying anything, and further explaining. We could potentially give a presentation to a board or something like that. So if that's something that any of our watchers would like to organise, certainly come and speak to us.
Always here.
So that brings us to the end of our first episode of Off the Record, Alice.
Off the Record. Oh no, it's been great. It's great. Super interesting topic.
Yeah, we'll see you next time.
Thank you.